Okay, so hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I am Cecilia Rikap. I am IIPP's head of research and also an associate professor in economics here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose from UCL. And I'm delighted to have here today Kojo Koram presenting his book. Actually, this book presentation is part of a larger series. Today we are starting the second round of this book presentation series. The first one went last year. And just in confidence, I should say that I invited Kojo last year, but he couldn't make it. He was on sabbatical, lucky you. And therefore, we are launching this second year of book presentations of prominent young scholars with his book presentation. As I want to emphasize this angle of books written by young prominent scholars. I think our disciplines do not encourage us to engage in ambitious projects, and this is why we want to celebrate those among us who have the courage to say, I'm going to ask a bold question, I'm going to ask it and answer it in a thorough, serious, complex, coherent way at the same time, and it's not only that, but actually the book that Kojo will present today is a book that is also about a crucial topic, a topic that should involve us all, and also that is at the heart of our concerns at IIPP. And I will take this moment just to say that IIPP's director, Mariana Mazzucato, is deeply sorry that she cannot be here today. I was telling them before starting that Mariana is in Mexico at the moment, and therefore it was virtually impossible for her to be here. But she sends her regards, and she's very happy that we're hosting this event. So let me go straight to present my colleagues here today. Dr. Kojo Koram, he is reader-in-law at the Birkbeck College of the University of London. And then we will have as discussant one of our professors, Reverend Professor Magee. He is visiting professor in cultural justice here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So without further ado, Kojo, the floor is yours, and thanks again for being here.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us here. This is quite a busy room to discuss topics of empire on a Thursday evening. Come to the front, one bite, lots of space here. Excited, maybe, people are thinking, oh, Black History Month has started, at least in the UK. Let's get our little empire event in so everyone can have that marked down now. If your DEI officer asks you anything, you've been to this event, so you got it covered. But I think it's really interesting to be talking about the topic of empire, which often gets bracketed and kind of placed within the cul-de-sac of race and identity conversations within an institution that's done so much to interrogate questions of economics, of inequality, and of the structures that produce the insecurity that we see so much around us, because that was really the kind of driving theme of me writing Uncommon Wealth, was to try and tie these questions around empire, around race, around decolonisation to the current economic crisis that is destabilizing life, not just in the former empires, but right here in the former imperial metropole itself. And so I'm going to present a little bit on the book for a while, and then I have the honour of being in conversation with Keith and with all of you around the themes that we introduce. So just let me see if this works, perfect. I guess a little bit about the context through which the book emerged. The genesis of Uncommon Wealth, I think, was really tied to the recent eruption of interest in conversations of empire that appeared in the British media and political mainstream over what I would argue is the last 6 or 7 years. Following, say, 2016, Britain suddenly remembered, oh my goodness, we had this whole 400-year empire. We forgot about that. And I would say, beginning with the kind of Rhodes Must Fall movement that obviously took inspiration from what happened in South Africa, but, it demanded the pulling down of the Cecil Rhodes statue in Oxford, and then really accelerating with the kind of British instantiation of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to the murder of George Floyd. We suddenly saw conversations around Britain's imperial legacy transition from academic journal articles and academic conferences onto the front page of newspapers, onto, breakfast news channels. Good Morning Britain was suddenly talking about this question around empire. And that was something that I found in some ways encouraging. It was interesting to see this confrontation with Britain's imperial legacy, which isn't an automatic assumption of what would be the response of the murder of a black man in Minnesota in the United States of America, would lead to this conversation around Edward Colston in Bristol, or the Robert Mulligan statue, or all of these different questions around how does our imperial legacy colour the very architecture of our lives. I thought that showed that there was clearly a long suppressed need to have this conversation within the United Kingdom. But I was also in some ways frustrated as to the register and framework of the conversation, which was entirely kind of imprisoned within this space of questions around identity, and eventually I feel kind of eroded into a position of another frivolous topic in a never-ending culture war. And so that for me was the way in which the kind of British establishment almost, Brazilian jiu-jitsu'd the sudden interest in questions around empire. All of a sudden people are talking about empire, and so we can move away from the invisibilization of empire that existed prior to that to the kind of frivolization of empire. All of a sudden, the debate around empire was, it began with, what are the statues that are in our public square? Should we have a Colston statue? Should we have a Mulligan statue? Should we, have statues of these, people who profited from plantation slavery or imperial violence in our public streets? And then it became, what are the names of the streets that we list? What's the name of our schools and our buildings? But then it became, should a picture of the Queen be up at Oxford Union? That was a whole debate around empire. I don't know if people remember. If we really go back to that, the kind of peak of that 2020 debate, should Jane Austen be read? This was the decolonial conversation that was being had at the time. There was a whole week in which the entire British press, front page of the newspapers and our breakfast news channels, were debating about whether it was or wasn't imperialist for the BBC to still show episodes of Fawlty Towers. I don't know if anyone remembers that. That was the sphere of the debate. And I remember watching that and thinking, I'm not sure that whether or not people watch Fawlty Towers was the motivation of Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere. That wasn't what they were campaigning for. Empire wasn't around this question of, this cultural exchange program. I had a line in the book where there was this whole manufactured debate around, is the placing of Jane Austen on English literature curriculums something that is pro-imperialist? There was and I know some of the people who are involved in this at Durham, so I know that this was just a standard transition of the main novel on their English literature curriculum, which they do because academics change curriculums every once in a while, and they moved Jane Austen and brought in a Toni Morrison book, and that got taken up by the Telegraph and the Express as, now, if you are caught reading Jane Austen on a university campus, you'll be beaten to death by decolonial activists. Jane Austen's been cancelled. This is what's going to happen as a result of colonization. And I wrote in the book, this is not what empire was about. Nobody got on a ship in the 18th century and sailed across the Atlantic to give someone a copy of Persuasion. This is not the driving purpose of empire. The driving purpose of empire, the British Empire, like any empire, whether it's the Mongol Empire, whether it's the Songhai Empire, is material. It's about the extraction and transfer of resources across large jurisdictional territories. And I thought that that was what was being ignored in this conversation around Britain's imperial legacy. And it was being ignored purposefully in order to decouple the way in which Britain emerged as an imperial power from the very real issues that people were facing on a day-to-day basis. And I think it couldn't be better articulated by a phrase by, kind of one of the great kind of anti-decolonial culture warriors, an academic, or at least he was an academic, and I think he's now left now, Matthew Goodwin at Kent, who wrote once you leave the university campus or the Twitter bubble, nobody cares about decolonization. That people don't have time for that. You know, people have rent to pay, people worry about public services, people worry about escalating wealth inequality. Okay, maybe if you work in a nice university or a nice, museum, some cultural institution in the South, you might have time to worry about decolonization, but real people with real problems, this has got nothing to do with you. That was the message that I feel was being expressed in this kind of culture war, and Commonwealth was really a complete confrontation with that position, because I felt that empire is nothing if not material, and whether you want to think about the asset economy that we're facing now, whether you want to think about the structure of tax avoidance that exists across the world, whether we want to think about the absolute dominance of multinational corporations that we all have to confront in terms of framing the type of society that we want to live in, all of that is incredibly indebted to a history of capitalism that is entirely saturated with not just imperial history, but particularly the British Empire. And so that was really what I kind of spoke about in Commonwealth. So this was, pushing back against, the way in which decolonization was presented as an attack on British culture, and people like Boris Johnson, people like Nigel Farage, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg would try and distract from that conversation by saying, we're worried about real issues, we're worried about, the left behind towns, the post-Red Wall towns, the places where people have forgotten the material struggles that they're facing. And so, how do we reintegrate this history of capitalism with the history of empire? I think, first of all, we need to recognize how much of the architecture of contemporary capitalism is indebted to the British Empire. What is it that the British Empire facilitated when we think about the role, I'm a legal scholar, and you think about the kind of role of the English common law system all across the world. There's a reason why London Commercial Court remains the arena of preferred dispute for commercial transactions all around the world, because of the history of the pound sterling being the world's industrial reserve currency before the dollar was, because of the sterling area, because of the role that the crown dependencies continue to play in terms of the emergence of the offshore world. And I'll talk hopefully a little bit about that in the latter part of this presentation. When we think about the way in which the City of London continues in so many ways to be the kind of point of convergence for the conducting of financial transactions all across the globe, even deep into the 21st century, that is tied to the history of the kind of gentleman imperialists that really drove the British imperial project. And so when we want to think about the British Empire, I wanted to just to return to those legal, financial, and economic structures that were put in place in the British Empire, and that crucially, many of them remained in place during the process of formal decolonization. And so, what I also wanted to do in this book was kind of move away from this idea of decolonization purely as a metaphor. And this is something that I think was perhaps an internal conversation with comrades and colleagues within the left, where there was a significance of the question of decolonization taken up, but primarily articulated through the language of, we might think of the Mignolo-led decolonial school of Latin America. We might think about the way in which ideas around decolonizing, whether it's language, whether it's perspective, whether it's our ideas around our own identities, did move away from the conversation of like formal decolonization. This isn't just a kind of a metaphorical description in terms of coming from the kind of jurisprudential tradition that I emerged from, although a critical one. Like, decolonization is a formal legal process that really did happen. Like, people aren't making this up, Matthew Goodwin. Like, in the 20th century, people shifted legal categorization. it's a shift. It's similar to say criminalization is a shift from one particular legal status to another legal status. Decolonization was a transfer of people who were in a legal category of being colonial subjects into a legal category of being formal sovereign entities. And we can see just how wide-ranging and how transformative that was in that slide presentation that I've placed up there. All of these different territories, from Barbados to Malta to Kenya, go through this process of transition in a short 10-year period when we're thinking about how the scope and the jurisdiction of Britain changes in that era. And I think, we often talk so much about the kind of 20th century conflict between capitalism and communism, or we talk about the impact and significance of the world wars in the 20th century. The process of formal decolonization could be argued, I think, to be the most transformative event that happens in the 20th century in terms of reorientating the coordinates of our global order. And so, what does this mean for capital, particularly for the corporations that gained such prominence during the era of British imperialism? Because one of the things that I think really distinguishes British imperialism from its kind of European competitors or rivals was its, if you wanted to be sympathetic about it, much more skillful use of private capital in terms of advancing the heavy lifting of imperial territorial seizure. Whilst we might think of, the French Empire or the Belgian Empire, especially with, the role of King Leopold as being much more state-based projects, the British Empire kind of really distinguished itself by having this conveyor belt of ostensibly private corporations, of course, in a kind of public-private partnership with the state. You required a royal charter to have the monopoly over imperial, if it's the Royal Africa Company, they have the monopoly over the trade of slaves in the Gulf of Guinea, whether it's the Royal Niger Company, but ostensibly private. Whether we think of, the Hudson Bay Company, we think of the African Lakes Company, or we think about the company that, historians like William Dalrymple or Philip Stern, who wrote fantastically on this company, argue is still the largest corporation and most powerful corporation that's ever existed, even in the age of our Googles and our Amazons today, which is, of course, the British East India Company. And so these corporations, outside of maybe the Dutch VOC, I think really stood far out in front in terms of making the endeavor of European imperialism a corporate and commercial endeavor. And also, I think, helped insulate the kind of British story of what is British history from this question of empire. Now, the kind of British history that you learned, at least I learned when I was in school, remained that kind of island story that Michael Gove talked about. It's 1066, and then it's, the Tudors, then it's the gunpowder plot, and then it's the world wars, all of a sudden it's the Blitz. But it's everything is contained within this particular island territory. And what happens in India, well, that's not British history, that's the private dealings of the British East India Company. What's that got to do with us? Or, the creation of the state of Nigeria, well, that's not Britain, that's the Royal Niger Company. That's got nothing to do with us. And so I think that privatization of a lot of empire played such a crucial role in actually insulating the historical record in Britain from imperial endeavors. And so, with these corporations that have so profited from the global scope and architecture of British imperialism, in the 1960s, facing the almost metastasization of sovereignty and independence, now all these different territories that you operated upon all have at least a formal recognition of state sovereignty. They have pathways to elect local leaders who have their hands on the instruments of state governance, who can place tax regulations and labor regulations and, questions around trade protectionism. This creates, I think, a tension point which its resolution of which I think explains so much about the neoliberal world that we're operating today. And I'll try and make this kind of concrete through a particular vignette that I think explains so much about how we might connect what happens in the history of British Empire and the 20th century history of decolonization with the economic struggles that we face in the world today. And this is a story of the Anglo-Iranian oil company and its conflict in Iran with Mohammad Mossadegh. So, a quick recap for those who might be unfamiliar. Iran, Persia was often referred to in Britain, was part of this kind of orbit of informal colonies that Britain enjoyed, places like Hong Kong, places like Argentina. And the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was the latest in that conveyor belt of private companies that were doing much of the heavy lifting of British imperialism. So, I can speak about this a little bit later, but a gentleman called William Knox Darcy discovers oil in quite a dramatic way in the Abadan region of Persia, is able to gain the rights to mine the oil within that territory, and creates first the Anglo-Persian and then the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in order to profit for that, and of course in public-private partnership with the British state all the time. This is all going swimmingly from the perspective of the company until you start getting this post-war wave of decolonization and what's referred to as kind of third world sovereignty spreading across the globe in the aftermath of the Second World War. And Mohammad Mossadegh was seen very much as a symbol of this particular moment. You can see there that he was actually Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1951. So much was he seen as a harbinger of the world to come. And so Mossadegh, elected as Prime Minister, says, with these new powers of state sovereignty, I intend to nationalize the refineries in the Abadan region and use the resources in order to fund education, housing, essentially a kind of a welfare state within Iran. And, whilst compensating the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company for the seizure of, essentially what's their property. Now, perhaps the most interesting thing about this particular tension point is who the government of Britain was at the time that Mossadegh takes this action. And the government in Britain at the time is the now heavily romanticized Labour government of Clement Attlee. And so for those of us familiar with the kind of internal British story, this is, start the kind of sepia-tinged, romance music, the Ken Loach 1945. This is the high point of British socialism and social democracy. The Attlee government is the government of the NHS, of council house building, of the welfare state, and perhaps most crucially for this story, this is a government that nationalized huge swathes of the British economy in order to fund the construction of the welfare state, whether it's telecommunications or rail. It was essentially quite a similar project to what Mossadegh was trying to do in Iran. And so you might expect people who are familiar with Bevan and Attlee and all of the kind of discourse around that particular government, that their approach to what Mossadegh was doing in Iran might be, well, you're trying to do what we're trying to do. Fair enough, we understand where you're coming from. But that was not the response that they gave Mossadegh. They try to get a UN Security Council resolution in order to actually wage warfare on Mossadegh in Iran. That failed. They took Iran to the ICJ, the newly created ICJ, in order to have a case which would declare the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's resources illegal. The ICJ said this is not a dispute between, to kind of turn the kind of difference between the private company and public state on its head, where they said the ICJ has been set up for disputes between nation states. This is not a dispute between a nation state. It's a dispute between one sovereign nation state, Iran, and a private corporation. So this has got nothing to do with us. And so when those kind of legal avenues failed, the British government and now the Attlee government had been replaced by the next Conservative government, which was headed up by former lobbyist of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Winston Churchill, showing that revolving door between state and private corporation. They worked on the kind of anti-communist paranoia of the Eisenhower government in the USA to say Mossadegh's going to lead to a communist wave all across the Middle East. We have to get him out of office. And so they were able to support what's now been declassified and revealed as Operation Ajax, the coup d'etat that removed Mossadegh from government. He died in house arrest, and the properties are returned back to the Anglo-Iranian oil company. Now, an interesting story, but I can also imagine people saying in 2024, what's that got to do with understanding the economy that we now face? You know, this is tragic, but, you know, how is this connected to the world that we're disputing at the moment? Part of the reason that this is relevant, I think, is because the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, like so many of these private corporations that did the heavy lifting of empire, didn't simply disappear with formal decolonisation. They just changed names. You know, a coup d'etat is kind of bad for the public brand for a company, so they rebranded and became first British Petroleum, and then what people will be now familiar with, of course, as BP. And writing about this particular conflict in 2021, and especially in 2022, when the cost of living crisis started to pinch, made me think about that particular quote that Matthew Goodwin placed at the start, where he said, people don't have time to care about decolonisation if they don't work in university or they don't spend all their time on Twitter. They've got real problems. There's a cost of living crisis, there's an energy crisis that's being disputed. Well, what does BP do in 2022? Oh, let me get to this. Ooh. There we go. At the time that the book was published in 2022, BP was not only cited as being one of the UK's most consistent tax avoiding firms, often getting a tax rebate from the state, despite recording billions of pounds in profit, not only being critiqued for being one of, or being responsible for potentially the largest environmental disaster on record with the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, and other critiques around contributing to the climate catastrophe that we were all wrestling with, but also at the time in which everyday people in Britain were feeling the pinch of the explosion in their energy bills and having to choose between feeding their children or heating their home, when we were getting reports around pensioners having to ride on the bus all night just to have a place to be warm, the chairman of BP described the energy crisis as turning his company into, and I quote here, a cash machine. And so if we want to understand the kind of protection and prevalence that BP enjoys in the 21st century, I don't think we can do that without understanding the genealogy of which BP came from, and we can't understand that genealogy without understanding its history as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the way in which the British state formed in such a great extent to protect private corporate wealth through the imperial endeavor. And so by bringing in stories like the Ashanti Goldfields Corporation in Ghana, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in Iran, the role of the main, at least according to the Tax Justice Network, 3 corporate tax havens in the world today that are at the forefront of the offshore world, just happening to be British overseas territories in the Cayman Islands, the BVI, and Bermuda. That history of empire, I think, plays a crucial role in helping us understand how wealth inequality still continues to escalate in the 21st century, and we can't hope to confront that wealth inequality without having a better understanding and engagement with that history of empire. So I could keep babbling on about this, and I might maybe make this presentation available, but in order to have a conversation with Keith and your fine selves, I think I'll probably bring that to a close now. But that was really the kind of motivation and theme of Uncommon Wealth. So thank you.
So my first 2 questions you've already answered. But I want to talk about the book for a bit. So in the book, you highlight the connection between colonialism and neoliberalism. How do you see a neoliberal policies as a continuation of imperial structures?
Fantastic. The connection between neoliberalism and colonialism in the book, I try to make concrete through this theme or this concept that I shamelessly stole from Aimé Césaire, but he also shamelessly stole it from his wife. I dug through the archives. Suzanne Césaire really is kind of the originator of this idea of the boomerang, which, gets associated with Aimé Césaire, so I didn't feel so bad about shamelessly pilfering it. But the Césaires came up with this idea, I think, of the boomerang, which referred to the way in which colonial violence that happened in the hinterlands of the colonies didn't simply remain there, but eventually came ricocheting back and impacting the very heart of empire. And so they often talk about it in relationship to kind of the emergence of mid-20th century fascism. And so talk about how the violence of the Italian invasion of Abyssinia laid the roots for the early genesis of Italian fascism. They talk about the systems of population control, ghettoization, and eventually extermination that the German Empire visited upon the Herero people in what we now call Namibia, laid the framework for that structures of ghettoization, dehumanization, and extermination that was then visited upon the domestic population in the era of the Third Reich. And so what I wanted to do within Commonwealth was look at, those kind of incidents like the protection of the Anglo-Iranian oil company in the colonies in the kind of post-1960s moment, and see how that laid the groundwork for the boomeranging back of insecurity of work, corporate protection, and escalating wealth inequality, growing precariety that we all wrestle with, even here in London, in the very heart of the biggest empire that the world's ever known in terms of territory, in terms of population, in terms of wealth. And I think that is an element of the story of neoliberalism that's often been forgotten. That so much of neoliberalism, as I say in the book, kind of happened first and worse in the global south. And then once, those regions were kind of used as almost a petri dish, a sphere of experimentation for these kind of actions, they started to herald back within the heart of the former empire. And I think it takes a real myopia to not imagine that's how capitalism would operate. You almost feel like with the protection that the Ali government gave to BP, it's like, what did you expect to happen back in Britain? Like, do you expect the BP are going to be like, oh, we don't want to pay tax in Iran or Nigeria, but we love Britain so much that we definitely want to pay tax here. They're going to be like, no, can we figure out how not to pay tax in Britain as well? Like, this seems to be great. And it's, I think, a real tragedy that in a lot of ways, the kind of protection that the Ali government gave to British corporate colonialism, not just in Iran, but in Malaysia and Cyprus and a lot of other places, in many ways kind of laid the tracks for the erosion of the welfare state that they put so much work into building here in Britain, now we're in the 21st century, As I say in the book, it's almost like they had like imagine if you had like a family pet, like a dog, and you were saying that like, okay, outside of the house, you can like buy everyone, inside the house you have to behave, but outside the house, go to the toilet where you want, buy people's kids, just cause destruction. And then like 10 years later, you're like, wow, this dog's destroying stuff inside the house. I didn't see this happening. That's kind of the relationship that I see Britain having with its corporate colonial entities, which has led to so much of the erosion of the welfare state that we see all around us today.
Okay, brilliant. What role do former colonies, particularly in the global south, play in the current global economy? And how does that reflect the legacy of British imperialism?
And that's a really good question. I think that's a question as well that, again, gets ignored because so many of us are kind of tied into this teleological understanding of how history moves. And I think this actually stretches across the political spectrum. You know, whether you're reading Adam Smith and David Ricardo, whether you're reading Karl Marx, there's an idea that like the tensions and contradictions of capitalism are sharpest here and begin here in Britain, and then everyone else in the world is on a pathway to become like Britain. Right. And I think that when we look at the role of capitalism in the 21st century, we actually see some of the sharpest points of capital contradiction in the former colonies, you know, and that's both in terms of the poverty side of it, but also in terms of the kind of wealth side of it. There's an assumption, you know, I remember being young and, you know, you see like depictions of Africa in the British media, and it's always like, you know, starving children and people in complete poverty. And then, you know, you go to like Accra or Lagos, you know, you go to Victoria Island in Lagos, you go to, you know, Banana Island in Lagos, you'll see houses there that look like this campus. You're like, you know, you'll see people with unfathomable wealth that are at the very forefront of capitalist relations of production, as well as having being in complete proximity with incredible poverty. And so I think there's actually an importance of seeing how has capitalism emerged in the former colonies, almost as a kind of more naked space, in order to see the dynamics that I think are going to emerge, you know, in places like the United Kingdom, places like the United States in the 21st century. There's a fantastic article that the political economist Quinn Slobodian wrote for the New Statesman, I believe, where he talked about how if we want to think about the 19th century as being the British century and the 20th century as being the American century, in many ways we need to look at the 21st century as being the Saudi century, as in the structure of kind of authoritarian, draconian, but highly kind of highly rocket-fueled finance capital that is really being kind of cultivated in the Gulf, is going to be the kind of frontier model of capitalism that we're going to start seeing implemented as we start getting more authoritarian and more draconian governments, even in places like the United Kingdom and the US.
Okay, thank you, thank you. How do you think Britain can begin to meaningfully address inequalities and injustices stemmed from the colonial past? And what policies or actions would you advocate for?
So, I mean, there's a kind of broad philosophical and ideological reorientation that I think will be necessary to confront how indebted the British state is to legacies of empire, which I think is so foundational to Britain. You know, I write in the book, or I probably even said today, it rolls off our tongue. We always say that like Britain had an empire, and then that presupposes that there was this coherent entity called Britain that then went around the world creating an empire, and historically that just isn't accurate.
Correct.
The reality is, be more accurate to say that the empire had Britain, that what we call Britain is a product of this imperial endeavor. Before we get the 1707 Act of Union, England already has a colonial relationship with Barbados back to the 1620s, with Jamaica, which is the 1670s. It already has, the Virginia slave colonies in what's now modern day America. It already has slave forts in Ghana and Sierra Leone, modern day Ghana and Sierra Leone. It's already an imperial entity. And, if we read the, writings of, some of the kind of canonical kind of Scottish authors, people like Robert Burns, they talk about what they consider to be the primary motivation for the Scottish nobles to even enter into the Act of the Union and create what we call Britain as being to get in on the game, get in on the colonial loot. Scotland had its own failed imperial endeavor with, what's referred to as New Caledonia in modern day Panama, and the attraction of empire is very much what produces this jurisdiction of Britain today. So that's how central that is to Britain. And so I think it would take a long ideological shift to confront that, but on a very kind of basic policy, immediate lens, there's so many laws that remain on our books from empire that, the removal of which I think would easily be within the power of a British government, and that would lead to a much more equal economy. To give you examples, one that's already been debated and it seems like this Labour government's going to roll back on is the non-dom tax status. And so, there's been debate around that, ever since Rishi Sunak's wife got exposed, and people have always been, this is weird. We've got this tax status that people can enjoy, where they don't have to pay taxation upon the wealth that they accumulate outside of the jurisdiction of Britain. But no one talks about the fact that non-dom tax status is a direct hangover of the imperial structure. Like, it was introduced in order to encourage, at least in its original form, encourage the imperial entrepreneurialism that I talked about with those kind of private companies, so that the money that you make in the empires, you didn't have to pay on the income tax that, Pitt the Younger introduces, 1799, I believe. That's one thing that the government could get rid of. The fact that, there's still so many secrecy and lack of transparency laws that govern the British overseas territories. And we often, again, talk about them, when that erupts in the British media with the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers, we often talk about, like, the Cayman Islands and the BVI, like they're these distant Caribbean tropical hideouts that, no one ever, he's taking the money to the Cayman Islands. It's nothing you can do now. Maybe if James Bond gets in there, he can get it back. But otherwise, who knows what goes on the Cayman Islands? These places are as much British territory as Blackpool or Bristol or Birmingham. And if a British government wanted to have complete transparency around the wealth that is being registered within these territories, they could do that tomorrow. If we want to find out what the British government can do in its overseas territories when it wants to, we just need to ask the people of the Chagos Islands. They were able to remove an entire population from one of its overseas territories in the Indian Ocean in order to set up a military base for the Americas. And so if you can expel an entire population of people to Mauritius, I think you can probably find out which companies are registered in one of your overseas territories. And so there are direct policy changes that I think we could demand of a government today that could create a more equal world. And of course, we know the way in which the offshoring of wealth accelerates wealth inequality in places like the United Kingdom, and this isn't just, we often talk about the tax revenue that gets taken there, which can't be funneled into, healthcare and education and things like that. We don't talk about how that money then comes back into seizing assets over here. Billions of pounds of housing are purchased through offshore vehicles in London, and it's that kind of hoarding and then that kind of hiding and then hoarding of wealth that happens through the offshore mechanism that means that people aren't able to buy houses in cities like London. Whether you, work or you don't, this now, that separation between the world of assets and the world of wealth is heavily indebted to these legacies of British Empire. And I think a British government could be demanded to make those changes, as well as having that much broader kind of confrontation of who are Britain outside of the empire. I don't know if people have read the work of the fantastic and late Scottish philosopher Tom Nairn, who with Nairn and Perry Anderson talked about this idea that Britain is an empire, and outside of the anchor of the empire, even the constituent parts of Britain no longer hold together as a whole. And I think that it could be a generative conversation in Britain to be okay, if Britain was an empire, not that it had an empire, was an empire, then what is Britain outside of that? What type of constitution should Britain have outside of that? Could be a conversation.
Thank you. What are your thoughts on reparations? And how does it fit into this narrative?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to kind of destigmatize reparations. Again, reparations is always presented as, at least when it relates to black people, it's presented as this this is the craziest, most terrifying idea. How could this be? Who could even calculate? Who would get it? It's an impossible situation. Again, as a person who works in legal scholarship, reparations happen all the time. there's very few transitional justice processes that don't have some sort of reparative justice element to them. Whether you think about, the current transitional justice movement that's being discussed in Colombia, of course, people will be familiar with the aftermath of the Third Reich. Like, reparations happen and reparative justice mechanisms happen in jurisdictions all the time. And so, it's very exciting, some of the conversations that have happened in the CARICOM conversations and stuff and questions that are being made. I think that's really important. I think maybe one kind of coda I might add to those, and I guess this is kind of the theme of the book that I'm kind of drawing on, is I'm very much interested in the kind of architecture of imperial wealth accumulation, and much of it still remains in place. And I guess I do worry sometimes that if there is a reparative transfer of wealth without the dismantling of the architecture, that what you actually would get is, say, okay, British government says we're going to pay £100 million to the Caribbean countries for plantation slavery and colonialism, but we keep things like the fact that, people aren't familiar, that the highest court in the land in many Caribbean countries to this day, even independent countries like Jamaica, remains the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in Britain, which is a legal court that 99% of British people wouldn't have heard of. That your ultimate appeal to justice in many former colonies to this day is the kind of private advisors of King Charles. I guess I would worry that if you don't dismantle that structure, that you could say the British government pays £100 million, but keeps in place all these imperial structures of wealth accumulation. That money funnels back to London, and then 20 years later, when people are talking about the kind of economic struggles people are wrestling with in the Caribbean, the British government, oh, well, we paid you, we paid you £100 million. No, we don't want to talk about that no more. So that's, I guess, one coda that I would add. But otherwise, I think, if we are trying to transition out of empire, as we try to transition out of anything, reparations is part of that conversation. And this happens in transitional justice processes all around the world.
So I hate it when I come to these, or dislike when I come to these, and the discussant spends all the time and doesn't give you an opportunity to ask any questions.
So what we are going to do now, just to wrap up a bit, I'm going to ask you a few questions,
sure.
If you don't mind, and then we will open it to everyone. Just because I want to, if you can zoom out, and in the book even you also discuss about Brexit, and you put it into the context of what you are discussing. And I think that there is one question that, besides the relevance of the specific question of the book, I think that the question of sovereignty and what does sovereignty mean, or what can sovereignty mean, or if we can think of a progressive way of conceiving the idea of sovereignty that doesn't lead to nationalisms, and that at the same time is feasible in a global world. I would be curious to pick your brains on that, and at the same time to ask you to expand more. Like, the book ends with trying to propose an alternative, or thinking along the lines of where the alternative can be. So I was curious to hear more about your thoughts on that.
I think that's such a challenging question to kind of wrestle with. First, I'll stay with the kind of question of, what does sovereignty mean? And I think this is something that, I kind of bookend the project with conversations that I remember having with my granddad around the kind of hope and optimism that surrounded the moment of national sovereignty that spread around, the decolonial movement, starting in, the aftermath of the Second World War, and, maybe extending, people might say, to the transfer back of Hong Kong in 1997. And then the kind of disappointment that people, I think, in what people might call the developing world, the global south, the former colonial world, wrestled with that failure of that realization. I remember my granddad saying to me that, it was a celebration of 50 years of Ghanaian independence, and, all around Accra with these, signs of national sovereignty, 50 years, blah, blah, blah. And I remember him saying, there's a whole lot of nationalism and very little sovereignty. There's such little control over the different areas and orders of public life within countries like Ghana, that how can you claim sovereignty? And in fact, you only end up with this kind of xenophobic and rather nativist nationalism as a result of that. And I think in my more generous moments, I see a lot of that frustration within the within some of the within some of the arguments around the generated Brexit, even though it ended up being this incredibly damaging policy change on the actual British nation state, I feel that a certain element of it was trying to articulate a frustration with the extent to which so much of the political terrain had been kind of bracketed out of the control of everyday people. And in a kind of inarticulate sense, it was redirect. Oh, it must be the EU. The EU is the reason why I feel like I can't ever change anything. That regardless of who I vote for, there continues to be this escalation between asset prices in the world of work. There continues to be the precariety of employment. There continues to be the eradication of public space. Like, it must be the EU, but I feel that a lot of it was kind of, frustratingly trying to wrestle with where has this idea of sovereignty gone? Take back control. That germ of trying to exert some sort of control within the political order. And so, can you decouple sovereignty from nationalism? I don't know whether I would have the answer for that, but I think it's a project that we need to try and invest in and think about how can sovereignty exist beyond borders and in a transnational sense. What arenas, what spaces, what forums can we use to try and exert control? And by sovereignty, at least, I often articulate it as what is the pathway for people to exercise their will on their political context? What are the democratic pathways and how much of it has been, again, drawing on the language of Prince Slobodian, what he describes as encased from the actual democratic sphere. If your ability to set taxes, your ability to determine labor relations, your ability to invest in a social welfare system has been bracketed out of the control of the governments, as we see in so many global south countries through conditional loan agreements and through structural adjustment programs and through these other means to say you actually can't decide on that, then you don't really have a pathway to determine your political order. And so I think trying to create transnational instruments for encouraging greater democratic participation, I think, is a way to try and encourage sovereignty without it being so tied to this kind of xenophobic and nativist kind of lexicon. And so that's something I would carry some hope in.
Yeah, while I was listening to you, I was also thinking what you said before about Queen Slobodian, of this being the century of the South, or how the South or peripheral countries are kind of setting the tone of the conversation. And I think that in relation actually to sovereignty, it makes sense, because actually we cannot even claim that the US state is sovereign today. Like, someone will very quickly go and say, because of semiconductors and they are produced in South Korea and Taiwan, but actually I think that there is a deeper conversation, which is actually who is ruling global capitalism. And clear to me, those are big corporations. So in that regard, the suffering of the peripheral countries and the global south is also today taking place in the UK, in the US, and so on. And I think that it gives us even more reasons to read the book and learn from history. And on that regard, and just a very quick one, because I really want to move on to everyone to ask your questions. I'm very curious about the reception of the book among the decolonizing scholars, because really you're elevating the tone of the conversation. You started with your motivation of what you felt that was lacking in those discussions, and I'm curious to see if you feel that there was a sort of enhancement of the discussions after your book, or if you still feel that you need to confront with the idea to associate directly decolonization with more the realm of ideas and fighting for ideas and not connecting it to the material or the economic angle.
Interesting. I might answer the question in kind of two steps, because I think it's interesting the reception of the book in conversation with people invested in questions of decolonization in the former imperial metropole and in, the former colonies. And so I've been fortunate enough to speak about the book in, places like Nigeria and Ghana and a few other places. And there I feel that there was more of an appetite for understanding that the primary consequence of imperialism was economic. They look around the societies that they're in and, are like, in Ghana, Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. They're like, we got a lot of gold. Why are we so, struggling so much? And empire. So there was perhaps a bit more of a readiness for that conversation. I think in the United Kingdom, which I've been most familiar with, so much of the decolonial conversation often has orbited around, like cultural institutions, museums, art galleries, schools, and, people discussing how do we memorialize our society, the question of, what monuments do we have in our public squares. And, I don't think the book was an attack on that. I think that's absolutely essential and necessary. Like it's great that the people of Bristol, don't have to walk past a statue of a slave trader when they want to go and get like a coffee from Pret a Manger every time. Like that's a good development. But I think I wanted to move it beyond that and talk about, let's not just get rid of the statues of colonialists from our public squares. Let's look at the laws that actually made them rich and see how many of them are still on our books and see how we can remove them as well. And so I think that, that is something that is still emerging in the kind of broader British, I think, conversation. I think that there's still an assumption that questions around race and identity have very little to do with questions around economics and finance. And both of those two kind of communities, I think, struggle to speak to each other. It's seen as, the questions around race and identity, there's questions around culture and identity and privilege, and that's what we want to talk about there, and questions of, finance and economics, that's for kind of wonkish, bean counters, and trying to bring those two into conversation is something that I want to work on, with institutions like IIPP, and I'm sure many people in the room who think about, how race and capitalism interact with each other. But I think we still got probably a little bit of a way to go.
Speaking of the people in the room, we open the floor for questions. We will normally have a mic that I don't see, so. Yeah. This tiny thing now, okay.
Yeah, we're going to keep it on the stand. That's that.
Okay, I will pass it to you.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. I found it riveting. And I feel like a conversation like this attracts a very specific set of people in academia, people who are interested in topics like this. And as you had mentioned, people's bottom line of rent and where am I going to be able to, find a house. And in the age of Twitter activism and people on TikTok spewing their hot takes, and in an era of such polarized ideas and topics, I'm curious how you think we can take a conversation like this in academia home. I think about it's the holiday season. We go home and have these challenging conversations with that problematic uncle or whoever it is. How can we all have been through this? But I'm really curious how we can take a conversation like this to the dinner table. Thank you.
Shall we get over 2 or 3?
Sure.
Would it be okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so there on the back, if we can. Oh, I can go.
Hi, Kojo. Thanks for that. I have 2 questions. One was your last point in trying to connect race with capitalism. And if you go back to, obviously, and the privatization of empire, and I'm particularly interested in oil companies, and taking kind of frontier of academic research into the history of the establishment of those oil companies, particularly the racial hierarchy they introduce in Iran and in the Gulf, right? So the categories of race, the kafala system, bonded labor that still exists, were founded in what was called the American lake, the oil, and in the Gulf, right? So like these kind of categories that we still abide by, who the white expat is, who the migrant laborer is, were instituted through the oil companies. And that kind of revisionist history of those things help us understand, some of the racial problems that endure. So I just wanted to extend that both to kind of the internal dynamics of those oil companies as well as the not geopolitical, but and then I want to connect that to ongoing genocides today, all right? The difficult things that we have to reconcile with the genocide in the Congo, the genocide in Palestine, and obviously very soon we'll be seeing the retaliation on Iranian oil fields and other places within Iran. How do we connect? Is it a legacy of empire, or is there still elements of empire that exist in terms of the relationship between the West and the global South through these genocides and through the military conflict, the big military conflicts we're seeing today? Thanks.
Do you want to go with this one, or shall we take one more?
Of course, yeah.
One more?
One more, yeah.
Okay, the gentleman over there, or also the gentleman over there on the back. We will have another round, no worries.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was very good. The question's a general question in that when the global, what chance is there for the global South when we produce leaders like Nkrumah, Mossadegh, Patrice Luamba, and they all get eliminated by the West, and the people who are in power in the global South are an elite that almost are handpicked and kept there by the global North, and their dreams and their children's dreams are of coming to the West, being educated in the West, and circulating their money and income through the West.
Interesting. Brilliant. Cool.
Why don't you just
Sure, I'll take those, yeah. And then, those three big ones. Thank you. So, all three questions were, I think, really insightful and really, forced me to think about these topics in kind of broader ways. And so, the original question of how do we take this conversation outside of the academy and into a broader sphere, that influenced so much structurally about how I wrote the book, the type of language that I wrote the book in, the publisher that I chose. I didn't have an academic publisher, it was a trade publisher, and so that again influenced its kind of distribution. And I think not until later did I feel that a lot of the motivation of the book was trying to communicate the significance of empire to friends of mine who have never been inside of a university. So I grew up, it was in the era of the kind of the post-Red Wall moment. And I actually grew up in Liverpool, in the outskirts of Liverpool. And, those kind of areas were being presented as the areas Matthew Goodwin was talking about, of places where you've got nothing to do with empire, and in fact, the people who are marching for Black Lives Matter, the people who are marching for decolonisation, they're just attacking your culture. That's all it's about. It's attacking your culture. It's not about attacking your kind of, it's not anything that has any relevance to you understanding, why your local council doesn't have enough money to be able to fund a Sure Start Centre, and now that's being closed down. Why, you read these reports about offshoring of wealth, why you hear about, these companies implementing informal labor relations, and now you've got precarious conditions and you therefore don't have, security of employment, you're on a 0-hour contract and you're worried about paying. Why, your energy bills are escalating and you're, paying for, these day-to-day struggles of people, you're paying with a card, and that's leading to greater and greater insecurity. With the book, I think I really wanted to be like, take those issues and then trace them back to imperial origins. And so I think if we can try and find people's material concerns, in many ways, even though I try and push back against it, I still remain a crude Marxist bro and believe that, a lot of people's engagements with politics come from their material conditions, that material conception of history, that people are like, how do I reproduce my life tomorrow? And how do I care for my children? And I think if we can connect some of those issues to this history of empire, I think that there's a real potency and value in that. And I think that extends, I think the people, from black and brown communities are more fluent with that and more aware of how the history of empire impacts that. But I also, this isn't being recorded, so no one's going to see this, is it? It's fine. This is my big, I think, controversial idea that I think there's a big book to be written that I'm not going to write it. So if anyone wants it, you can have this, okay? I remember at the time of all the protests around the statues, you had those moments of the kind of statue defenders. And you remember those where you get white working class people standing outside a Robert Mulligan statue. Sometimes it was like a George Eliot statue. It's like, this isn't a war on statues, by the way. This is there's certain people, but this idea, standing outside, Edward Colston statue and all these kind of statues being like, we're not going to let you tear down our statues of these big imperial industrialists. And I almost wanted to be like, do you know what these people would have done to you? Do you know how deep down the mine they would have forced you and your family, or, the impact of British imperialism on, what now people like Goodwin, people like Boris Johnson would refer to as the white working class that they really, care for. I think there's an interesting book to talk about the impact of imperialism on white working class people in that time, of, the fact that white people will be press ganged into working for the East India Company. So you just be dragged away from the pub, thrown in the bottom of a ship, and sent off to go and die, trying to advance the economic interests of the East India Company. That children would be taken away from their family and sent to populate the white settler colonies and essentially get worked to death in Canada and Australia and these places. And that was going on until the 1950s and 60s and whatever. So I think that there's an interesting book. If you will write it, you will be attacked by everybody. And I won't defend you when that happens, just so you know. But I think that that'd be an interesting way to make the way in which imperialism impoverished the world for the benefit of a small few, I think, more connected to people's everyday to-day lives. And so that's, I think, one of the ways we can try and make it more relevant to more people. With a question around, first of all, thank you so much for, laying out how these categories of racialization influence the oil companies within the actual territories in which they operate and those companies themselves. I think that's a fantastic extension of what I was talking about with the Anglo-Iranian oil company. But connecting the two, and you can't talk about colonization without talking about the genocide that we're seeing in Palestine at the moment. And I think it's again another frustrating amnesia of British imperialism, that we talk about it like it's this strange theocratic conflict between these monotheistic religions that Britain's got nothing, who knows why they, no connection to Britain whatsoever, no mention of the Balfour Declaration, no mention of the British Mandate of Palestine. And in terms of how does that imperialism impact today, I remember reading, Jared Kushner talking about how, seeing almost the violence that's happening on the Gaza Strip at the moment as a certain form of primitive accumulation. He was talking about, incredible luxury real estate they're going to build on the Gaza Strip, once you've had the chance to actually purify the land of the population. And so we think about how that connects with finance capital and this question of, the insulation of wealth. I think we can start to see a lot of those overlaps. And then to the question around, what do we do with the fact that in the formal decolonial moment, all these leaders like, Mossadegh or Lumumba, or Nkrumah were either overthrown or murdered or pushed out of government. I think that is a significant part of the story of the 20th century. I think there is also a danger we should try not to overly romanticize those moments. They had incredible optimism and incredible power, but they also had their own blind spots as well. A lot of those kind of formal 20th century decolonial leaders as well. But I think it's incredibly valuable to kind of read what they produced, look at the endeavors that they advanced, and see how some of that might apply in a new context, in a new sphere, of global communication and collaboration. when we think about things like the Bandung movement and the Tricontinental Conference and the way in which that moment was able to facilitate global collaboration, and now we're almost more isolated than ever, even though we can communicate much easier across these regions than ever. I think that's a big inspiration that I think we want to take and think about how this might manifest in this new moment. In the book, I read a lot about the new international economic order movement that was really championed by Michael Manley in Jamaica and had a resolution that was passed through the United Nations. And if people want to think again about the connection between neoliberalism and the attack on decolonisation, it's well worth reading about Margaret Thatcher's role in killing the new international economic movement. It's one of the first things she did. She goes to Cancun to the first ever North-South Dialogue Conference and basically kills the new international economic order dead. And when you read the provisions of that resolution, a lot of it sounds like it could be written yesterday. We talk about, they're talking about having a right to food being secured in international legislative architecture. They talk about countries being given permanent sovereignty over national resources. I think in the 21st century, when a lot of the issues we're going to be facing will be inherently global, whether it's, more pandemics, whether it's, digitization of labor relations, or whether it's, of course, the climate catastrophe that's probably the most prevalent. Most of these issues aren't going to be able to be resolved within one jurisdictional space. They're going to have to be global, and I think we can draw a lot from what happened in the global south in the 1960s in order to try and expand our imagination. And so, learning from them whilst also not kind of overly romanticizing them, I think is, we've got to have some hope rather than, we're just going to get killed anyway.
Okay, we are going to move to a second round of questions. We have the men in the back, and then we will go, I was going to say very briefly to the people online. But if you can all be very brief, we can take first the question of the people here and then those that are online. Just as a footnote, speaking of the new international economic order, one of the last 2-year projects of the Progressive International was precisely to revive it, and together with many other scholars, we worked on a new program that is now live, so you can check on the website of the Progressive International and read it. It has updates and things are still the same, but also new things. So we go to the man on the back because he was already there from the previous round, and then I will go to a few of you here, like student PhDs from IIPP, just because of they are closer to our institute. You will have a moment to ask a question, but very brief, everyone.
Okay, hi, thank you very much for your very interesting talk and your work. I was going to ask a long question, but I will keep it very short. Would the British Empire be possible without the creation of the Bank of England?
Okay, so we pass the mic very briefly. There, Ruben, and here. There, I'm there.
Hello, thank you. I work on migration issues, and I'm trying to understand how immigration policies are used to control access to resources by not allowing legal access to territories that concentrate wealth. And I saw on your slide that you mentioned immigration, so I was wondering how you think it ties back to these colonial legacies and your perspective on immigration policies.
I'll try and keep this brief. So to me, it seems that in order to change things and achieve a better society, we need to understand the origins of this system itself. And sort of understanding where does the boomerang start, from where is it thrown, to what extent is this a story of the conditions in England at the end of feudalism itself and the power struggles within feudalism, the birth of agrarian capitalism, and the specific sort of separation of the political and the economic forces within England with very large landowners and this sort of centralized monarchy that can help to explain the specifics of the British Empire, which was the first capitalist empire, sort of like the rest of history. But yeah, I guess to what extent do we need to understand those dynamics to imagine what could be after this.
Can you pass it very quickly to the gentleman next to you, because he's next to you? Very brief, and then you answer whatever you can.
Sure.
And we go to another round if you're okay. Very
Sure,
quickly.
absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, two quick questions. One, can authoritarianism actually be delinked from domination of the group dynamic? And this is for human beings as a whole.
Okay.
And secondly, how would you push back against someone like me who believes that the UK is actually a vassal state of America?
Interesting. Brilliant. Well, first of all, thank you all for your questions. And I think I might even answer some of them in terms of overlapping with each other. I think particularly the kind of the first question, even the last question, this idea of what was the role of the Bank of England, what was the role of British finance in terms of driving the British imperial project, and would it have been possible without it? I guess it would have been, I think it would have potentially been possible, in terms of, so many of the royal charters are being given by, the original corporation of the British entity, which is of course the Crown, but it wouldn't have been as rocket fueled, it wouldn't have been accelerated, it wouldn't have been propelled without the interplay between the kind of elevated financial architecture of the British state with the endeavour of what they called imperial exploration that was really driven by those private companies that I mentioned. And I think this is a story that we need to learn in order to understand a lot of the genesis of financial literacy that we often lack, I think, in the 21st century. Even things like shares, the idea of shares. So I think it's something, again, which could get a much broader appeal, whilst conversations around empire tend to be framed quite divisively. To say to people, if you want to understand everything from the specific role of the City of London and its kind of quasi-autonomous jurisdictional position, to the emergence of the Bank of England, to the proliferation of shares as a mechanism for people to be able to collaborate in the profit-generating endeavour, you have to understand histories of empire. Shares of joint stock corporations really gained prominence in the imperial endeavour because this was a way through which people could source resources, and enter into an arrangement where a ship would go across and whatever tobacco or coffee is brought back by Sir Walter Raleigh can be shared amongst the people who had invested in that project. And so a lot of that, I think, continues to facilitate the movement of global capital in the 21st century. And this is just to jump to the last question, where I think complicates our kind of easy assumption that Britain is simply just a vassal state of the United States of America. The United States of America is, and has been, since the kind of Treaty of Paris in 1898, following the Spanish-American War, the prominent hegemonic power in the international arena. And, if we look at the kind of proliferation of American and military bases around the world, we look at the dominance of American corporations, we could in many ways say, capitalism is driven by the United States of America. But I think in many ways, a lot of the train tracks of empire still run through Britain in a lot of ways. The City of London is still the place in a lot of ways. London's real estate, remember in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all of a sudden the British public recognised that, we have all these oligarchs who invested in London. This is strange. They all decided to buy their, they must really like Madame Tussauds. Why are they? No, because this is still the place where if you are able to hoard wealth across the world, by having a position in government and massacring a village and monopolising the resources, this is where it flows through. It flows through London's, private wealth managers. It flows through your City of London Bank. You want to get yourself into, a bank account in one of the offshore territories of the United Kingdom. You want to purchase, a house in Belgravia or Mayfair or Fitzrovia. You want to send your kids to Eton and Harrow. That's the legitimacy of it as well. So I think in a lot of ways, a lot of finance capital still flows through London specifically in a way that I think gets easily masked and forgotten when we think of, oh, well, Britain just depends on the special relationship of America, otherwise it's irrelevant. So that's what I think I'd add to that as a qualification, although I recognize your point. I'll try and go through the questions quickly, sorry. To the migration question, I think that a huge part of the aftermath of formal decolonization was the essentially creating borders for people whilst at the same time trying to protect a borderless world for finance and to keep the matter kind of quite constrained. I think a perfect example of this is, probably the most famous kind of colonial figure in British political history, which is Enoch Powell. And so Enoch Powell is often remembered for being this kind of xenophobic, anti-migrant politician, rivers of blood, championing the placement of all the different migration laws that separated out colonial subjects all around the world. My granddad was as well, he always used to say, when I came to England, I was referred to as a migrant. He's like, I wasn't a migrant. I didn't have to migrate anywhere. Like, I was a colonial subject moving from the colonies to the metropole. And he's also like, I didn't want to come. You came to me. I was chilling on the beach in Accra. You came to me and was like, motherland needs rebuilding, and that's why I came. But there was no migration pathway for people to go through, which obviously, when we had the Windrush scandal, we saw the consequences of that. And so in the aftermath of decolonization, you start getting the British Nationality Act of 48, the Immigration Act of 71, up to the Nationality Act of 81, creation of borders. And this is what Powell's championing. But simultaneously, the other side of Powell that people forget is that Powell is the darling of Friedrich Hayek and the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Mont Pelerin Society and all of the great thinkers of neoliberalism. And just a few months after he gives a speech in Birmingham of the Rivers of Blood, saying, black man, whip hand, white man, blood, all of that stuff, he's speaking of the Mont Pelerin Society, talking about the removal of capital controls in order to create a free world for the movement of finance across borders. And so I think that that's an element of the migration, like the unfreedom for people tied to the freedom for capital.
We move very quickly to, if you can tie up 1-2 questions, or if we have a lot, maybe, a couple, 2 or 3 from the people online.
Sure. I can share 2 questions from the online audience members. So the British Museum epitomizes the lootings by the empire. What can we do to redress this, and how should we put pressure to return the items? Secondly, you discussed the Anglo-Iranian company and its historical ties to colonialism. What is your perspective on contemporary monopolistic corporations, which are also highlighted in Cecilia's work? How do you view the role of these corporations in countries in the global south, particularly in terms of advancing or inhibiting decolonial development, innovation, data control, and sovereignty?
I will go very briefly to one more, if you can, because I've seen the man here on the front raising his hand a lot. So, and I'm so sorry. You can ask him later.
I just want to say, what's the future of what's happening next? Because the way I kind of see it is that the way formal colonies, especially one colony that has surpassed Britain in GDP rankings and is of India, it's got more English-speaking and educated people in this country. Do you see that children of immigrants in this country who are part of the decolonised movement have effectively quit Britain for their ancestral homes, and which could lead to a return of empire with a vengeance, and in a way tried to take back control, probably affect a retaliation to that quiet quitting?
Interesting.
2 minutes
Okay.
for everything.
Awesome. So the British Museum, I think that this is, I probably refer to the work of people like Dan Hicks. I don't know if people are familiar with Professor Dan Hicks at Oxford, who wrote the fantastic book, The British Museum, who are probably more familiar with the kind of structures around how institutions archive and hoard, different artifacts from empire, and what are the claims, what are the demands that can be made in order to try and facilitate those, the transfer of those back, the idea that, I think Dan mentions that it's easier for the Benin bronzes to be in Britain than it is from someone actually from Benin. So if you want to be able to migrate from a former British colony, it's better to like disguise yourself in an artifact, and then they'll keep you here rather than being transferred back. But I think that that's a conversation that's really being accelerated by people who work within those arenas. And so I think that I would recommend people read Dan's The British Museum for that. And then I think the question that you made about essentially, places like India, places like Nigeria, places like obviously China as well, playing such a significant role, you might say for better or for worse, in the 21st century, and what does that mean for the children of these areas, and what does that mean for Britain's relationship with its imperial past to these areas? I mean, there's an amazing, if I could think of one second, like there's a vignette that I include in the book from Tony Blair's autobiography, which I read, so you don't have to, but where he talks about going to facilitate the handover of Hong Kong back to China, and talks openly about being in conversation with the Chinese premier, where he says, he's talking about wanting to move on from the past of violence, and Blair says, I have no idea what he's talking about. Like, he had no idea about the Opium Wars, even though that's the reason why Hong Kong was in Britain's hands in the first place. And I think that kind of myopia around what is the British history in India, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Pakistan is going to be more and more significant in how Britain mobilizes and navigates the 21st century than it was even in the past century. There was those reports of the trade strategy that the Foreign Office was trying to introduce in the aftermath of Brexit being codenamed Empire 2.0, and then being surprised that they were going to these, like you say, now quite economically muscular former colonies and being like, hi, we're back. And they're like, you're not wanted, and being surprised by that. I think that the lack of fluency that Britain might have around these histories, and stuff like the Opium Wars, stuff like the Bengal famine, stuff like the unification, like these are central parts of the national story in some of the most significant countries in the 21st century. I think being ignorant of that is going to damage the United Kingdom. It's not just the kind of, you need to learn about empire to be a good person and to help the kind of poor brown people elsewhere, but in fact, to be able to navigate how you operate in the 21st century to a certain extent. So that's something that I think, I don't know if that directly answers your question, but it's what your kind of question provoked thought in my mind. Thank you.
Okay, so we have run out of time. I'm so sorry. I know that you had a question. You can ask him if Kojo is okay. You can ask him afterwards, and probably there were other questions that we couldn't address. But this is just pointing us all to the importance of the conversation that we had today. I mean, there were so many hands up and also questions coming from the Zoom. I couldn't be happier about this conversation. It was a pleasure having you both, and of course, in particular, Kojo. And just to close this session, let me remind you that this is part of our research seminar series. And on November 14th, we will have Ilia Salami presenting The Spectre of State Capitalism. And also on January 21st, we will hear Silvia Wico presenting on the political economy of ecological transitions. So thanks a lot for being here, and good evening.